Show right here on 910 AM the Superstation, the voice of Detroit. Hey, I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep. Today is Sunday, January 21st, 2018, and tonight we have a very exciting show planned for you tonight. A lot to talk about, a lot going on. We know that the government is in the second day of a shutdown, this Trump shutdown, right? We'll talk about that some in the second hour. First time in U.S. history that there's been a government shutdown when one party has been controlled the White House and both chambers of the Congress also. But, you know, that's Donald Trump. He said he was the great negotiator, right? Okay, whatever. So on tonight's show, you know, last week we dealt with Dr. King in the for a few minutes of the second hour of the show. So, you know, Monday, January 15th was Dr. King Day, right? And I didn't have as much time to talk about Dr. King and some history regarding him as I wanted to. Okay, so we're going to do that in the first hour of the show. We're going to jump right into that. We're going to deal with 6 myths about Dr. King we need to stop believing. 6 myths about Dr. King we need to stop believing. We'll also deal with the day that Dr. King met Malcolm X. The day that Dr. King met Malcolm X. What happened that day? Why was it so significant, right? That was March 26, 1964. The day Dr. King met Malcolm X. We'll talk about that as well. And then we know that yesterday, Saturday, January 20th, and today you had the Women's March. You had the second annual Women's March. Yesterday we saw marches in Chicago. We saw them in Washington, D.C. We saw them in Los Angeles, we saw 600,000 women come out, right? So what was this Women's March about, okay? And there were African-American women there who were marching, organizing, protesting as well. So we're going to deal with some reasons why African-American women were there protesting also. And we know that on the second day of the march, which was today, that was taking place in Las Vegas, we know the theme was around voting and registering women to vote as well, okay? Power to the polls was what they were talking about today. So we'll talk about that as well. And we know today's theme was actually the power to the polls. Actually was today's thing, power to the polls. And we know Tamika Mallory was one of the co-organizers last year and this year also of the Women's March, okay? So there was a lot of coverage on cable news about it. I was watching MSNBC yesterday and today, and I saw African-American women being interviewed about it as well. So we'll talk some about that, right? And then Colin Kaepernick is back in the news. So YourBlackWorld.net had an article we posted on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network, earlier in the week. Colin Kaepernick dismisses those who honored Dr. King on Dr. King Day, but criticized Colin Kaepernick for his peaceful protests. Some of the same people, and some of these Republicans, and even some of these black Republicans running around, who criticized Colin Kaepernick for his peaceful protests, protesting the oppression of African Americans and people of color, all right, honor Dr. King on Dr. King Day, right? I guess you haven't studied Dr. King either. We're going to talk about that hypocrisy. And then, you know, last week we talked some, and we'll talk a little bit more about that this week, that data shows that African immigrants are the most educated in the U.S. And this is behind, this information came out behind Donald Trump's S-hole comments Thursday, January 11th, right, which caused a firestorm, which also the breakdown in negotiations, the breakdown in the deals, led to this Trump shutdown of the government, okay? And we know the Root.com had an article, Africans are the most educated immigrants in the U.S. Somebody should tell Donald Trump that. He obviously doesn't know that. But the L.A. Times Los Angeles Times, LA Times had a big article regarding this as well on January 12th, 2018, the day after that meeting took place where Trump made these white supremacist comments. African immigrants are more educated than most, including people born in the U.S. Right? Very, very interesting. Okay? So somebody should get this. Maybe Senator Tom Cotton, or maybe Senator, one of these other senators, or maybe Stephen Miller, one of these white supremacist senior advisors to the president. Maybe Stephen Miller can share this information with Donald Trump, because he's totally clueless. Then we have an update on the story about the Kansas congressperson from the state representatives, Stephen Alford, who said that black people can't handle marijuana because of their genetics and their character makeup, right? We have an update on that story because the NAACP has, we have an update on that story, and then we also have an update on the story about the 63 people who were arrested in Cartersville, Georgia, that we talked about last week because police were called to a house party celebrating the 21st birthday of somebody there, and less than 1 ounce of marijuana was found. And since nobody claimed it as theirs, police arrested 63 people because they said they all had access to less than 1 ounce of marijuana. Now, the majority of the people who were arrested were African-American males 18 to 25. Well, now the NAACP has gotten involved in that case. We're going to talk about that also. And then a new study shows that white extremists killed more people in 2017 than any other domestic terrorist group. White extremists have killed more people in 2017 than any other domestic terrorist group. Notice how Trump didn't tweet about that. Notice how Trump was pretty silent about that. I wonder why. And then the government shutdown enters its second day. They're supposed to take a vote at 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Monday morning, 1 a.m. In a few hours, they're supposed to take a vote. Mitch McConnell has called for a vote, and we'll see what happens there. All right, and then we'll deal with this date in African American history. All right, so on the African History Network show, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right now it corrects wrong behavior. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you have been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. So when you control the radius of a man's thoughts, you can control the circumference of his actions, because the mind can't do or teach what it doesn't know. Now, we deal with a number of different topics here on the show. We deal with current events and history and politics, education, economic empowerment, entrepreneurship, relationships, love, sex, health issues, and much, much more. Sign up for our email newsletter. Text the word Kemet, K-E-M-E-T. Text the word Kemet, K-E-M-E-T, to 22828 to sign up for our email newsletter. You can also go to our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. You can sign up for the email newsletter there as well. All right. Now, if you want me to do a presentation for your group or organization, African American History Month is coming up. Okay. If you want me to do a presentation for your group or organization, you should email me now. Info, INFO at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. The calendar's filling up. I'm not playing. I'm serious. Email me now. Info, INFO at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. INFO at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. All right. And you can also call me. Call me after the show. Don't call me during the show. 313-462-0003. 313-462-0003. You can call me if you want me to do a presentation for your group or organization. African American History Month is coming up, and I got a ton of information. Okay, I will be doing a lecture series Saturday, February 3rd, and Sunday, February 4th, 2018, at the new Nandy's Niles Cafe, located at 71 Oakman Avenue in Highland Park, Michigan. You'll hear more about that. It's a free event. Come on out Saturday, 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., Sunday, 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Okay, and we'll deal with, it's my presentation dealing with the history of African American History Month, dispelling myths about our history, and then also we'll deal with, the second day, we'll deal with the light of ancient Egypt awakens the African mind. The light of ancient Egypt awakens the African mind. So, presentation I've done a couple of times, and people really learned a lot from it. And I deal with the connection between ancient Kemet and the Africans known as the Moors, and a lot of information there as well. Okay. All right. So we'll have more information at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com this week. Okay. So the call-in number is 313-778-7600. 313-778-7600 is the call-in number if you have a question or comment. All right, so you know that last Monday, January 15th, was Dr. King Day. And you had a lot of Dr. King Day celebrations. And, some were better than others. Okay. As I said before, I don't get invited to speak at a lot of Dr. King Day celebrations because the the type of information I deal with is hard to pimp white corporations and foundations for guilt money. When I start talking about how the civil rights movement was not a nonviolent movement and start providing evidence of it, and start talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, who said that she kept a shotgun in every corner of her house, and the first white man that it looked like he was going to throw some dynamite on her porch would not live to write his mother. This is a direct quote from Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's a quote from Fannie Lou Hamer, right? So in the conversation about Dr. King, a lot of people talk about Malcolm X, and they draw comparisons between Dr. King and Malcolm X. And they ask about, the day that Dr. King met Malcolm X, what happened? So that was March 26, 1964, okay? So this is the same year of the March on Washington, which took place August 28, 1963. I'm sorry. That was March 26, 1964. This was after the March on Washington, okay? This is, 64 is the same year of the Civil Rights Act, okay? So in 63, leading up to this, right, November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. We know that Malcolm X, because of his remarks about chickens coming home to roost, he's suspended from the Nation of Islam for 90 days. This leads to him permanently separated from the Nation of Islam. He officially separates from the Nation of Islam March 8, 1964. Okay. In 63, you had the Birmingham campaign of April and May of 1963. We know Dr. King is jailed for 8 days. I think it was 8 days in Birmingham, Alabama, during the Birmingham campaign. And this is when he writes a letter from a Birmingham jail. We know it's also in 1964, Dr. King is going to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Okay. In 64, you also have the Civil Rights Act that passes in July of 1964. But Dr. King and Malcolm X met March 26, 1964. Okay? And this was during the U.S. Senate debate for the Civil Rights Act. Now, this is the only time that they met, and they only met for a couple of minutes. It's the only time that they met. And they met on Capitol Hill. Dr. King was stepping out of a news conference when Malcolm X, dressed in an elegant black overcoat and wearing his signature horn-rimmed glasses, greeted him. Dr. King said, "Well, Malcolm, good to see you." Malcolm replied, "Good to see you." Cameras clicked as the two men walked down the Senate hall together. Malcolm X told Dr. King directly, quote, "I'm throwing myself into the heart of the civil rights struggle," end quote. Now, as I talked about in my presentation at Andy's Knowledge Cafe on, January 13th, Saturday, January 13th, I talked about how when Malcolm officially separated from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm got involved in the civil rights movement. And this is something that's not talked about Malcolm, okay? 64 and 65, very, very pivotal, important time because Malcolm's philosophy was evolving. He talked about the need to register to vote. He helped fight for the Voting Rights Act. He helped to radicalize the civil rights movement. And when you read June 28, 1964, when Malcolm announces the formation of the Organization of Afro-American Unity that Dr. John Henrik Clarke helped him to organize, when you go to blackpast.org and you actually read his speech, he lays out a political agenda, he lays out an economic agenda, he lays out an educational agenda. This is Malcolm X. See, people don't talk about Malcolm getting involved in politics and talking about how we need to get something tangible for our vote. We need to register to vote. We need to vote. People don't talk about that about Malcolm because the Nation of Islam did not get involved in politics. They did not advocate for us to vote, run for office, register to vote, things like this. When Malcolm separates from the Nation of Islam, he can speak freely. He can speak for himself. So Malcolm tells Dr. King, March 26, 1964, quote, "I'm throwing myself into the heart of the civil rights struggle," end quote. Dr. King would later say, "He is very articulate, but I totally disagree with many of his political and philosophical views, at least insofar as I understand where he now stands." Now, this is before Malcolm goes to Mecca. He goes to Mecca late April and May, and he visits about 14 countries, meets with 11 heads of state. Okay, so this is before Malcolm goes to Mecca. So the exchange would last only a minute, but the photo remains a haunting reminder of what was lost. They would never meet again before both of them were assassinated. First Malcolm, February 21st, 1965, at the Audubon Ballroom, right, in Manhattan. And then Dr. King, April 4th, 1968, Memphis, Tennessee, Lorraine Motel. So that moment, on March 26, 1964, on Capitol Hill, will continue to be analyzed by scholars for its importance and its potential. Every word will be scrutinized of what they said. Some will call it the moment the two leaders reconciled. Others would say they were never that far apart. They both had the same goal: equal rights for African Americans and justice for African Americans as well. This is what they both were fighting for. So Dr. King and Malcolm were often seen as adversaries in the black freedom struggle. Malcolm X advocated a nationalist approach to equal rights for African Americans. He often taunted Dr. King, criticizing him for subjugating African Americans to their white oppressors and teaching them to be, quote, defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken a people into captivity, end quote. In one interview, Malcolm X dismissed Dr. King as a, quote, 20th century or modern Uncle Tom, end quote. Dr. King ignored the criticism. He said, quote, "We still advocate nonviolence, passive resistance, and are still determined to use the weapon of love," end quote. This was in 1956. This was March 22nd, 1956. So this is basically in the 4th month of the Montgomery bus boycott. So Dr. King was 27 at this time. So if I remember correctly, he was 26 when the Montgomery bus boycott started, December 5th, 1955. His birthday, January 15th. So March 22nd, 1956, he would be 27 years old. Okay, so he was fresh out of college, getting his PhD from Boston University. He had been living in Montgomery, Alabama for less than a year when the Montgomery bus boycott starts, and he was drafted to be the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. He didn't even want the position. He was asked to be the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was an organization formed to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. So Dr. King, in March 22nd, 1956, said, "We still advocate nonviolence, passive resistance, and are still determined to use the weapon of love." He said this earlier. He said this during March 22nd, 1956, at a news conference in Montgomery, Alabama. He said, quote, "We are still insisting emphatically that violence is self-defeating, that he who lives by the sword dies by the sword," end quote. Now, although Dr. King and Malcolm X held what appear to be diametrically opposing views on the struggle for equal rights, scholars say by the end of their lives, their ideologies were evolving, but also their ideologies were converging. And if you read the book Martin, Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare by James H. Cone, Martin, Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare by James H. Cone, he looks at different speeches towards the end of both of their lives, and it shows how their ideologies were converging. Dr. King was becoming more militant in his views of economic justice for African Americans, and more vocal in his criticism of the Vietnam War. So his first public speech in opposition to the Vietnam War was April 4th, 1967, called Beyond Vietnam. And Dr. King was assassinated exactly 1 year to the date from his first speech in opposition to the Vietnam War, April 4th, 1968. He came out in opposition against the advice of other civil rights leaders. They said, no, he said, stick to civil rights. They said, don't speak out against the war. It's going to cause problems with allies of the civil rights movement. It's going to cause problems with President Johnson. President Johnson turns on Dr. King. when Dr. King comes out in opposition. And overnight, Dr. King becomes the most hated man in America for speaking out against the Vietnam War. So Malcolm X, who had broken with the Nation of Islam, right, by this time, by 64, had dramatically changed his views on race during his 1964 pilgrimage to Mecca. 8 months before, now, what most people don't know is that 8 months before Dr. King and Malcolm X met briefly, March 26, 1964, on Capitol Hill, Malcolm X sent a letter to Dr. King requesting a meeting. Okay? The letter was dated July 31st, 1963. The return address was Muhammad's Mosque, number 7, 113 Lenox Avenue, New York 26, in New York. This was when Malcolm was still with the Nation of Islam. Because if you watch the documentary Make It Plain, which is probably the best documentary on Malcolm X, and most of them about Malcolm I've seen. Okay, I've seen Brother Minister and By Any Means Necessary, and most of the documentaries on Malcolm X I've seen. Make It Plain is probably the best one. And Make It Plain has Dr. John Henry Clark in there, one of our great Grandmaster Scholar Warriors who was friends with Malcolm X also. And they talk about in the documentary how towards Malcolm's tenure with the Nation of Islam, he felt that nations should get involved in the civil rights movement. He felt the nation should be doing more for African Americans in general. So Malcolm sent a letter to Dr. King requesting a meeting. This is dated July 31st, 1963. Malcolm X opened the letter with the greeting, "Dear Sir," and he called for a united front against racial oppression in the United States. Malcolm wrote, quote, "The present racial crisis in this country carries within it powerful destructive ingredients that may soon erupt into an uncontrollable explosion. The seriousness of this situation demands that immediate steps must be taken to solve this crucial problem by those who have genuine concern before the racial powder keg explodes. A united front involving all Negro factions, elements, and their leaders is absolutely necessary." Now here's Malcolm reaching out to Dr. King, calling for a unification of African Americans and their leadership to fight against white supremacy and racism. Malcolm X goes on to warn that a, quote, "racial explosion is more destructive than a nuclear explosion," end quote, citing a recent meeting between President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Malcolm goes on to say in the letter, quote, despite their tremendous ideological differences, Malcolm says, "it is a disgrace for Negro leaders not to be able to submerge our quote-unquote minor differences in order to seek a common solution to a common problem posed by a common enemy." Now this is Malcolm calling for a unification of African American leadership. Most people don't even talk about this about Malcolm. Okay? Now we're going to continue this on the other side of the break. And a lot of this information comes from an excellent article from the Washington Post written by Deneen L. Brown, January 14, 2018, called "Martin Luther King Jr. Met Malcolm X Just Once. The photo still haunts us with what was lost." Okay? I'm Michael Imhotep. You listen to the African History Network show. 313-778-7600. 313-778-7600 is the call-in number. We'll be back in a few minutes. 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, the future of radio. Welcome back to the African History Network show right here on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, the future of radio. Hey, I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network. Hey, if you want me to do a presentation for your group or organization, there's a lot of information I talk about. A lot, you won't hear this in a lot of other places. You have some people that talk about it, but a lot of things I deal with, you're not going to hear a whole lot of other people talking about it. You can email me at info at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. African American History Month is coming up. Used to be known as Black History Month. It's been African American History Month for a few years now. And that's one of the things I talk about. Okay? So I have a whole presentation dealing with the history of African American History Month and why it was created, and a lot of people don't really understand how to celebrate it. So you can email me at info, info at africanhistorynetwork.com, info, info at africanhistorynetwork.com. Calling number to the show, 313-778-7600. 313-778-7600 is the calling number if you have a question or a comment as well. Okay. All right. So right before the break, we were talking about the day that Dr. King met Malcolm X. Okay. The day that Dr. King met Malcolm X. And that was March 26, 1964. March 26, 1964. This was at the U.S. Senate debate on the Civil Rights Act of 64. This was on Capitol Hill. And we were talking about how in 1963, Malcolm X sent a letter, July 31st, 1963, the letter was dated. He sent a letter to Dr. King calling for a united front against racial oppression in this country. And he was saying that African Americans and African American leadership need to come together to fight against a common enemy. And he talked about how if President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev can meet together, he said, despite their tremendous ideological differences, Malcolm said it's a disgrace for Negro leaders not to be able to submerge our minor differences in order to seek a common solution to a common problem posed by a common enemy. So here you have Malcolm while he's still with the Nation of Islam. This is before he's suspended. That comes after Kennedy. President Kennedy is assassinated. It was November 22nd, 1963. This is July 31st, 1963. This is basically 1 month before the March on Washington, which was August 28th, 1963. And Malcolm was at the March on Washington also, and he talks about it. So Malcolm X invited Dr. King to a rally in August of 1963 in Harlem to analyze the race problem and the solution. Malcolm promised to moderate the meeting and guarantee courtesy for each speaker. Malcolm requested that if Dr. King could not attend the rally, to send a representative. And he closed the letter with an endearment, your brother, Malcolm X. Now, Dr. King declined the invitation and did not send a representative according to the book Malcolm and the Cross, The Nation of Islam, Malcolm X and Christianity by Louis A. DeCaro Jr. Malcolm and the Cross, The Nation of Islam, Malcolm X and Christianity. So we all know on August 28, 1963, Dr. King would lead more than 250,000 people in the March on Washington and deliver his now famous I Have a Dream speech, which was originally called a council check. He was the last speaker. Now keep in mind, the March on Washington was organized by the labor movement, and civil rights leaders were brought into it. So Dr. King was the last speaker. He was scheduled to be the last speaker. He was originally scheduled to speak for about 4.5 minutes. He spoke for about 16.5 minutes, almost 17 minutes. Majority of the time he spoke extemporaneously. Okay? And Dr. King talks about the conditions that African Americans were dealing with then. He talked about voter suppression. He talked about African Americans moving from a smaller ghetto to a larger ghetto. He talked about racism and white supremacy. And he talked about how they were there to hold America accountable for a promissory note that was given to us 100 years prior. And when we go to the bank to cash that promissory note, is marked insufficient funds. Okay? So he talked about police brutality. He said we can never be satisfied as long as we are victimized by unspeakable horrors of police brutality. Now, isn't it interesting how Republicans that want to always quote the I Have a Dream speech never talk about Dr. King talking about police brutality in the same speech? I don't even think they've ever really even read the full speech. I really don't. I don't think they've read the full speech. He talks about voter suppression. Okay? He talks about how we can't stop while the Negro in the South, he talks about voter suppression. He said the Negro in Mississippi can't vote, and the Negro in New York believes that he has nothing to vote for. The Negro in Mississippi not being able to vote is because of voter suppression and the Jim Crow laws. So how is it that white Republicans and some black ones, you hear them on the radio. I'm not going to call any names. How is it they want to quote that I Have a Dream speech, but they don't talk about Dr. King calling out America on its hypocrisy and calling out voter suppression and police brutality in the same speech they like to quote or misquote. So you should go to LOC.gov, which is the Library of Congress's website. LOC.gov, which is the Library of Congress's website. And you can actually read the text of the I Have a Dream speech, originally called a Council Check. See, you should read it as opposed to listening to it. Because when you listen to it, you get caught up in this prophetic voice and you miss certain things. When you actually read the text, you're going to actually get a totally different impression about this speech that's often misquoted. And then this is why they just show you the last 2 minutes of the speech on the television. Every Dr. King Day, they show you the last 2 minutes. They usually don't like to show you the full speech. They usually don't like to show you Dr. King calling out America on this hypocrisy, right? They like to focus on the dream portion. But the original draft of the speech and original drafts of the speech didn't even mention I have a dream. Didn't even mention that phrase. That's not what the speech was about. So the whole thing is totally twisted. So, on August 28, 1963, we have a march on Washington. 250,000 people were there. And Malcolm X attended the March on Washington, but he called it the Farce on Washington. And this is talked about in the autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley. So Malcolm said, quote, "Yes, I was there," Malcolm wrote. "I observed that circus. Whoever heard of angry revolutionists all harmonize and we shall overcome someday, while tripping and swaying along arm in arm with the very people they were supposed to be angrily revolting against. Whoever heard of angry revolutionists swinging their bare feet together with their oppressor in lily pad park pools with gospels and guitars and I Have a Dream speeches, and the black masses in America were and still are having a nightmare." So, now keep in mind, this is Malcolm before he separates from the Nation of Islam, before he goes to Mecca. I don't know if Malcolm actually talked about Dr. King calling out America on its hypocrisy. Okay? So we know November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy is assassinated, and this led to a push for the Civil Rights Act of 64, a major piece of legislation that Kennedy had supported. We know that's going to be eventually advocated for by President Lyndon Johnson. Okay? And that's going to pass and sign into law this July of 64. So during a rally in New York City's Audubon Ballroom, let me see. So those comments from Malcolm, that was during a rally in the New York City Audubon Ballroom. Okay. So in his Amsterdam News column, the newspaper, Amsterdam News, is an African American newspaper. And when you watch Eyes on the Prize, and they talk about the first installment, when they talk about Emmett Till, you see James Hicks, who was I think he was the editor at the time for the Amsterdam News, and he was there at the trial for the two men that killed Emmett Till, J.W. Millam and Roy Bryant. He was there at the trial, covering the trial for the Amsterdam News. So in the Amsterdam News, the column that Dr. King wrote, Dr. King mourned Malcolm X, the death of Malcolm. And he wrote, quote, "Like the murder of Congo Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, the murder of Malcolm X deprives the world of a potentially great leader. I could not agree with either of these men, but I could see in them a capacity for leadership which I could respect," end quote. Now, in a telegram to Malcolm X's widow, Betty Shabazz, Dr. King wrote, quote, "While we did not always see eye to eye on methods to solve the race problem, I always had a deep affection for Malcolm and felt that he had a great ability to put his finger on the existence and root of the problem," end quote. And we know that 3 years later, April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And most people don't know that Dr. King and Malcolm, I talk about this in my presentation, the distortion of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the revolutionary, will not be televised on the television. Dr. King and Malcolm were both 39 years old when they were assassinated. They were both very, very young men. They both left behind a wife. They both left behind children. Okay. The presentation I did, January 13th. If you want to order that, it's available at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. It's called The Distortion of the Legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Revolutionary, will not be televised on the television. Okay. And also available there is a presentation I did, Malcolm X 50 Years Later, Why Is He Still Relevant, as well. I did that June of 2017. Okay. 313-778-7600 is the call-in number if you have a question or comment. 313-778-7600 is the call-in number if you have a question or comment. All right. Okay, so let's deal with 5 myths about Dr. King that we need to stop believing and stop spreading. And this comes from an article from historian Donna Murch, M-U-R-C-H, who's a professor of history at Rutgers University, right? And the first one is that Dr. King believed in a colorblind society. Now, when I hear people talk about Dr. King was fighting for a colorblind society, things like this, I never heard Dr. King say he wanted a colorblind society. Because actually, like 67, 68, Dr. King is talking about being proud to be black and black is beautiful, things like this. And I'm like, well, where are you getting this from? So since Dr. King's death, Dr. King has emerged as a triumphant figure used to reassure us that the United States has transcended its history of racial strife. All of the minister's powerful oratory, these words from his speech at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 are some of the most cited. You know, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character, right? You know, this is oftentimes quoted by white Republicans who work to dismantle Dr. King's legacy. Right? They quote this. Now, they don't deal with the white supremacy and racism that Dr. King was fighting against, and that still exists today. But they just want to take this out of about a 16.5-minute speech. But interpretations of this quote vary radically. Conservatives, including Ronald Reagan, have enlisted it to rationalize opposition to diversity programs, because he was a white supremacist. In 1990, African-American pundit Shelby Steele, who's African-American, but he's a Republican, okay, titled his anti-affirmative action memoir, The Content of Our Character, A New Vision of Race in America. But Dr. King knew that the economy was not colorblind, and he believed that the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act would not eliminate racial disparity. So from 66 to 68, Dr. King transitions from civil rights to human rights. He starts really focusing on poverty, right? He takes things to another level. And then towards the end of his life, you know, he's working on the Poor People's Campaign. So after 1965, Dr. King fought against crisis levels of black unemployment in the Watts area of Los Angeles. He fought for open housing in Chicago. That was in 1966. Okay? And he was in support of striking African-American sanitation workers in Memphis. And he actually moved into the slums of Chicago for a period of time to really experience what was taking place in the poverty that's taking place in Chicago. If you watch the movie that came out in 1978 called King, that may be one of the best movies about Dr. King. And I haven't seen one on that level. It was made for TV. Starred Paul Winfield as Dr. King. Coretta Scott King was played by Cicely Tyson. Martin Sr., Dr. King's father, was played by Ossie Davis. You had Howard Rollins from A Soldier Story playing the part of Andrew Young. Okay, so that was fantastic. They just showed it on, I think it was BET, the female version of BET. They just showed that last week or sometime, I think it was. But that's an excellent movie. Now, there's only a few criticisms I have of that film. One of them is the fake meeting they had between Dr. King and Malcolm X. Because the meeting that they depicted of Dr. King and Malcolm X, one, never took place. because it takes place after Malcolm comes back from Mecca. Okay, and it shows them sitting down at the table, and when they actually met, they didn't sit down at the table. They only met for a couple of minutes. So if you saw the movie recently, and you saw that meeting between Dr. King and Malcolm X, that whole meeting, that meeting was fabricated. One, you know the time sequence was wrong, because it shows Malcolm with the goatee. Well, Malcolm only wore the goatee when he came back from Mecca. When you look at the pictures of Malcolm meeting Dr. King, March 26, 1964, Malcolm was clean shaven, because he had not gone to Mecca yet. So if you see a meeting depicted in a movie of Dr. King meeting Malcolm X and Malcolm's wearing a goatee, you know it's false. Because Malcolm met with Dr. King before he went to Mecca, not after he came back. So that's one of the few criticisms I have of the movie. Otherwise, it's a really, really good movie, and you can learn a lot from it. But I just have a real problem with that fictitious meeting between Dr. King and Malcolm X. In that depiction, I don't think they said that Malcolm said he was going to join the civil rights movement either. That may have caused too much of a shock to people. Okay, that may have caused too much unification. If they actually show Malcolm saying, I'm going to throw all my weight into the civil rights movement, and I'm going to join the civil rights movement, right? The other thing is, when you watch, you can call in 313-778-7600. Phone line's working? 313-778-7600. You can call in also. The other thing is when you watch the documentary Make It Plain, and it's on YouTube also if you want to watch it on YouTube after you finish listening to the show. When you watch the documentary, they talk about how there was a meeting called by Juanita Portier, and I think she was the wife of Sidney Portier. She called the meeting at her house. This was after Malcolm separates from the Nation of Islam. And it was a meeting of all the major civil rights leaders, including Malcolm, so that they can meet and get all their differences out on the table, clear the air so they can work together. And Malcolm was there. Dr. King couldn't make it, but he sent a representative. Okay? This meeting is not talked about a lot, and this attempt for these civil rights leaders and these African American leaders to work together is not really talked about. That's one of the reasons why that documentary Make It Plain is so crucial. Okay, so you have conservatives that always like to take the excerpt out of that 16.5-minute speech and quote Dr. King saying, I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Now, they don't want to deal with the conditions of caused by white supremacy and racism that led him to say this. They don't want to deal with that. Okay? So, King's assassination so after 1965, King fought against the crisis levels of black unemployment in the Watts area, Los Angeles, open housing in Chicago. He came out in support of the black sanitation workers in Memphis. And at the end of his life, he became particularly disheartened by the racial barriers to housing and jobs in the urban north and the west. So he takes the fight, because he only has 12.5 years in the civil rights movement. The majority of the fight was in the South. But after the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, right, he's going to go beyond that. And like I said, he from 66, 68, he deals with human rights, he deals with the Vietnam War. He's going to take the fight up north, he's going to take it out west also. So Dr. King's speech to Memphis sanitation workers a month before his 1968 assassination on the economic disparities between African Americans and whites is a better measure of his mature thought, because his philosophies were evolving as well, just as Malcolm's were, okay, towards the end of their lives. His words could have been written in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, okay, and he said, quote, when there is vast unemployment and underemployment in the black community, they call it a social problem. When there is vast unemployment and underemployment in the white community, they call it a depression. This is Dr. King. When there is vast unemployment and underemployment in the black community, they call it a social problem. When there is vast unemployment and underemployment in the white community, they call it a depression. So Dr. King explicitly linked racism to economics in ways that remain sharply relevant. In his view, only direct intervention by a strong federal government could counteract the historical disparities wrought by the overlapping forces of race and class, forces that were unlikely to disappear. And if you read How White Folks Got So Rich, The Untold Story of American White Supremacy, put out by the Nation of Islam Research Group, if you read Black Labor, White Wealth of Dr. Claude Anderson, as well as Powernomics, they actually deal with how it was because of public policies, the maldistribution of wealth, power, and resources based upon land and based upon laws and politics, things like this, that put African Americans in the predicament that we're in today. Okay? And Dr. Claude Anderson also deals with how we have to have a political agenda. Also, it's not just economics. Economics ain't going to solve everything. No. It's a political agenda because it's policies and laws kicking our behind. So, number two, the second myth about Dr. King is that his focus was on racism in the South. So in a 1993 survey, more than two-thirds of respondents said, quote, there had been significant progress toward Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of racial equality. This is 1993. Many biographical sketches of Dr. King focused on the epic Southern civil rights battles and on the transcendent imagery of his I Have a Dream speech. A 1 hour long documentary on CNN devoted 53 minutes to his life prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Now, Civil Rights Act is passed in '64. Okay, you had a 1 hour documentary on CNN, and it devoted 53 minutes to Dr. King's life prior to the passing of the Civil Rights Act, which passed in July of '64. Largely left out of this documentary was Dr. King's work between '64 and '68, including the Poor People's Campaign and his anti-war activism. And see, this is one of the problems with a lot of the Dr. King celebrations, speeches, depictions of him, right? They focus on either 55 to 63 or focus specifically on 63 as if he was in suspended animation like Captain America from 63 to 68, as if he didn't do anything after the March on Washington. And that's a totally distorted, that's a total distortion of Dr. King's work and his legacy. Okay, so Dr. King had not one dream, but many. He placed the fight for African American equality within the larger struggle for international decolonization. Because as I talked about before, the civil rights movement was taking place concurrently with the African liberation movement on the continent of Africa. So after 17 African countries won their independence in 1960, Dr. King observed in the letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote during the Birmingham campaign, he said, we have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace, gaining a cup of coffee at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Okay, we'll continue this on the other side of the break. 313-778-7600. 313-778-7600. We're dealing with 6 myths about Dr. King. We need to stop believing. This is the African History Network show. I'm Michael Imhotep. 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, the Future Radio. We'll be back in a few minutes. Welcome back to the African History Network show right here on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, the Future Radio. Hey, I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep. Call-in numbers 313-778-7600. 313-778-7600. It's the call-in number if you have a question or comment. Those watching on Facebook, share this broadcast on your own Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. Okay. All right, and we sent out an email blast shortly before the show started. So those who got the email blast, hopefully you're watching as well. Sign up for our email newsletter. Text the word Kemet, Kemet. Text the word Kemet, Kemet, the 22828 to sign up for our email newsletter. Text the word Kemet, K-E-M-E-T, the 22828 to sign up for our email newsletter also. Okay? All right. Let's see. On Facebook, Nicholas said it was Martin's letter he wrote while in the Birmingham jail. Yeah, that's a letter to a Birmingham jail. Okay, and that was in response to 8 white ministers who criticized him being in Birmingham, Alabama for the Birmingham campaign. Okay, and organizing people to protest during the Birmingham campaign. Okay, that's what that was. All right, you can read the article from theatlantic.com, called Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. Okay, this is from April 16, 2013. And Dr. King's famous letter from Birmingham jail, published in The Atlantic. It was originally published as, the title was "The Negro is Your Brother," and it was in response to a public statement of concern and caution issued by 8 white religious leaders of the South. Okay, and it stands as one of the classic documents of the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, and the article that I was citing from the Washington Post, this one is from Rutgers professor of history, Donna Murch. Okay, and this deals with 5 myths about Dr. King. And they were talking about what he wrote in the letter from a Birmingham jail. And Dr. King placed the fight for African American equality within the larger struggle for international decolonization. And after 17 African countries won independence in 1960, Dr. King observed in a letter from a Birmingham jail, he said, quote, "We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter," end quote. Now, in 1967, at the Riverside Church in Manhattan, Dr. King made an impassioned plea against America's aggressive anti-communist foreign policy, which had resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. And Dr. King denounced the United States as the, quote, "greatest purveyor of violence in the world today." Okay, this is in his speech when he comes out in opposition against the Vietnam War. It's either in Beyond Vietnam or the one he did late in April 67 called "Why I'm Opposed to the Vietnam War." It's one of those speeches. Now, while a sanitized image of Dr. King as a Southern civil rights crusader has been enshrined in popular memory, his dream of ending American militarism has proved more difficult to accept, because they don't want to deal with the revolutionary Dr. King. They want to deal with the Dr. King fighting to knock down Jim Crow laws and things like this. They don't want to deal with the revolutionary Dr. King. So number 3, Dr. King was the natural antagonist of Malcolm X. So Dr. King and Malcolm X, as we talked about previously in the previous segment, Dr. King and Malcolm X are often cast as opposing poles, with the former supporting nonviolent civil disobedience in the South and the latter encouraging angry armed rebellion in the North. But the icons actually have more in common than one might think, as we've talked about. Now, both men's political visions profoundly changed during their lives, especially towards the end of their lives. Early in his career, Dr. King focused on more limited programs of desegregation, but later believed a, quote, "radical revolution of values," end quote, in American society was needed. One journalist said the year before he died, which is 1967, that Dr. King, quote, "sounded like a nonviolent Malcolm X," end quote. Malcolm X had a revolution of his own, breaking with the Nation of Islam in '64, as we talked about, and offering support to Dr. King's campaign in Selma in 1965. Okay, this was the campaign to get a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act of '65. So both men held a deep opposition to the war in Vietnam as well. Dr. King saw it as a, quote, a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit, and called for a global revolution against poverty, racism, and militarism. These were the three evils that Dr. King talked about towards the end of his life: poverty, racism, and militarism. So isn't it interesting how a lot of these Republicans don't want to talk about Dr. King fighting against racism? See, they'll talk about content of his character, content of the character, right? And that he has a dream that his children will be judged by the content of their character and not their color. And then they create this myth that he was fighting for a colorblind society, which really that myth of the colorblind society, that comes from white Republican think tanks. But they don't want to deal with the conditions that led Dr. King to say what he said, which is white supremacy and racism. So Dr. King's stance came at a great personal and political cost to him. Nearly all of the major newspapers denounced him, and President Lyndon Johnson raged against his speeches when he comes out in opposition against the Vietnam War, April of '67. And never again would Dr. King be invited to the White House. Overnight, he became the most hated man in America. Like Malcolm X, who faced popular outrage for saying the chickens have come home to roost after John F. Kennedy's assassination, Dr. King also bore the pain of national censure and disgrace. Then also, the fourth myth is that Dr. King is irrelevant to the Black Lives Matter protesters, okay? And they talk about how in the civil rights movement you had the charismatic leadership, right? And that the Black Lives Matter movement is more decentralized, and they've learned from that, and they've embraced people like Ella Baker. But there's still a lot to learn. We know that during the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, behind the killing of Michael Brown, back in 2014, activist Tef Poe expressed his sentiments that this ain't your grandparents' civil rights movement. Well, they should really study and learn from your grandparents' civil rights movement. And Tef Poe's comments reflected how younger protesters have pushed against the politics of respectability associated with Dr. King, the NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, etc. And Black Lives Matter founders Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi have also critiqued the limitations of hierarchical male leadership models. But despite these differences, a deeper river of struggle connects civil rights and the Black Power activism to the movement for Black lives today. As seen in the Montgomery bus boycott, Bull Connor's Birmingham of '63, and Selma beatings of '65, local authorities tried to stop political organizing through police and vigilante violence, mass jailings, and brutality behind bars. Ferguson protesters who faced down tanks, tear gas, and assorted forms of military-grade hardware tasted what many activists suffered throughout the 1950s and 60s. As these examples show, the fight to end the criminalization of African-American protests and of African-American people more broadly lies at the heart of African-American freedom struggles then and now. In his eulogy for Jimmy Lee Jackson, so Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed, he was shot February 17th, 1965, and this was a protest fighting for a Civil Rights Act. This is going to lead to the Bloody Sunday and the march from Selma to Montgomery, which is about a 54-mile march to the capital of Alabama, which was Montgomery. And they were taking their fight directly to Governor George Wallace. Okay? This is what the march from Selma to Montgomery was really about. And it was precipitated because of the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was trying to protect his mother. And he shot and killed, I think it was state police that shot and killed him. Okay. All right, so when you look at in the eulogy for Jimmy Lee Jackson, Dr. King denounced the misuse of police powers, which he saw as an expression of white supremacy. He understood Jimmy Lee Jackson's shooting by a white officer to be symbolic of race-based killings throughout the country. And he said, quote, a state trooper pointed the gun, but he did not act alone. He was murdered, Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered by the brutality of every sheriff who practices lawlessness in the name of law. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician, from governors on down, who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. Number 5 deals with the myth that without Dr. King, the civil rights movement would not have happened, which is definitely was just not true at all. Now, one of the most controversial aspects of Ava DuVernay's film Selma, okay, which is about the fight for the Voting Rights Act of '65, coming out of Selma, Alabama, is its rendering of Dr. King as the catalytic agent for the Voting Rights Act at the expense of President Lyndon Johnson. Equally striking, though, is how it reflects the larger cultural tendency to represent the civil rights movement as an example of a great man history in which Dr. King eclipses other leaders and potential rivals, as Malcolm X and James Forman from SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who come off as an erratic, and James Forman who comes off as an erratic hothead. But there was organizing taking place in Birmingham, Alabama, well, in Selma. There was organizing taking place in Selma before Dr. King even got involved. And SNCC had already been involved in organizing African Americans for the right to vote in Selma also, before Dr. King got involved. So hidden even further from view by Dr. King's from Dr. King's presence there, and the legend of it, is the work of female civil rights activists, including Ella Baker, Daisy Bates, Joanne Grant, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Septima Clark, and others who helped build the human infrastructure of the civil rights movement, along with many working class and poor black people whose names we will never know. These women helped launch local campaigns that garnered national publicity and attention. In the words of civil rights scholar Charles Payne, quote, men led but women organized. Men led but women organized. Now, Dr. King himself was deeply conflicted about his role as the face of the civil rights movement. In the last speech of his life, he warned his audience, I've been to the mountaintop. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Now, with these words, Dr. King recognized the importance of collective struggle and placed his trust in the hands of present and future generations. So check out this article from Washington Post, WashingtonPost.com. It's by Rutgers University history professor Donna Murch, called 5 Myths About Martin Luther King. 5 Myths About Martin Luther King. Now, the 6th myth, and there's some others, but this is what we'll deal with here. The 6th myth is that Dr. King was a Republican. Dr. King is a Republican. You'll hear his niece, Alveda, say this, who's an idiot. She was on Fox News saying Donald Trump is not a racist. Really? Explain to me what a racist is. She's an idiot. She's a disgrace to Dr. King's legacy. BigProgress.org has an article from August 28, 2013. This is 5 years ago. This is on the anniversary. This is on the anniversary of the March on Washington. This would have been this is the anniversary of the March on Washington. No, Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Republican. No, Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Republican. But here's what he had to say about them. So there was And when you check out this article from thinkprogress.org, they have there was a billboard taken out. I'm not sure which city this was. There was a billboard from the National Black Republican Association that lied and said Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican. This is what the billboard says. Okay? Then they have the website of the National Black Republican Association. They're trying to pimp people and a lot of people, a lot of African Americans, to get them to become Republicans. Right? Now, what they don't want to tell you, so then they say, well, this was the party of Lincoln. Now, it is true that the Republican Party was founded in 1854 by groups of abolitionists as a direct result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 that dealt with the sovereignty of westward expansion and the government leading up to the U.S. citizens who were moving into these westward territories to determine for themselves whether they wanted to have slavery in those territories, as opposed to being dictated by the U.S. government. Okay? That's the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And as a result of that, you're going to have the formation of the Republican Party by groups of abolitionists. I think it was March of 1854, the Republican Party is going to be formed. And then we know November 6, 1860, that Abraham Lincoln becomes president-elect, okay, of the U.S., and he is a Republican. And him becoming president is then going to lead the following month to South Carolina, December 20th of 1860, separating from the Union, seceding from the Union. And then by February of 1861, you're going to have about 6 other states to succeed. And then April of 1861, you're going to have the Civil War that starts in these states that are succeeding from the Union. These southern states fear that Abraham Lincoln, who is a member of the Republican Party, which is formed by abolitionists, they fear that he's going to free the slaves. So in his inaugural address in March of 1861, he talks about how he has no plans and he's not going to free the slaves in states that have slavery. He's trying to reassure these southern states. Okay? So, but what they don't tell you is that because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the obstructionist Democrats that Malcolm oftentimes talked about, they're going to leave the Democratic Party, and where do they go? They go to the Republican Party, which is where they are today. They're going to leave the Democratic Party because of the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, Affirmative Action of September 1965, which was Executive Order 11246, signed by President Johnson. Because of the Fair Housing Act of 68, okay, these Democrats, these obstructionist Democrats that Malcolm oftentimes talked about, they're going to leave the Democratic Party and they go to the Republican Party, which is where they still are today. So these black Republicans that try to come out here and lie to African Americans, and one, tell them that Dr. King was a Republican, which he was not. He didn't belong to any political party. He had some conservative views, but he was not a Republican. Okay? And two, they don't want to tell you, wait a second, they don't want to tell you that because of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, those obstructionist Democrats leave the Democratic Party and go to the Republican Party. Strom Thurmond, white supremacist, who was a U.S. senator into his 90s, Strom Thurmond ran for president in 1948 as a Dixiecrat. Okay? And then 1948 is also when that Confederate battle flag was brought back out, okay, in opposition to the Civil Rights Movement, because you have a Civil Rights Act in 1947. Okay, before the modern day Civil Rights Movement starts. It was brought in opposition to, I think it was in 1947 when you had the desegregation of the armed forces. That flag was brought back out in opposition to African Americans fighting for equal rights. And then because of the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, Strom Thurmond leaves the Democratic Party and he goes to the Republican Party, where he was until he died, and he was in his 90s when he died. And a lot of other people did the same thing. So why don't these black Republicans who lie to you and tell you that Dr. King was a Republican, why don't they tell you that? So there was a quote that said, most people don't talk about the fact that Martin Luther King was a Republican. Now, this quote from Ada Fisher, a Republican National Committee woman from North Carolina, that was published without qualification or correction, it was published by ABC News. Now, this article came out August 28, 2013, so this is 5 years ago. Now, Ada Fisher is wrong on two fronts. First, many people talk about the fact that Dr. King was a Republican, which is false. It is asserted incessantly by conservatives on Twitter and elsewhere on the internet, and this idiotic billboard that the National Black Republican Association put up. I'm not sure which state this was. Okay? And you saw a lot of this taking place leading up to the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, which is August 28, 2013. Now, this claim is most prominently advanced by Dr. King's niece, Alveda King, who's an idiot that I just talked about. And she's a Republican, a sycophant for Donald Trump. And over the years, conservative groups have purchased billboards making this claim. It's false. And second, Dr. King was not a Republican, and he was not a Democrat. Dr. King was not a partisan and never endorsed any political candidate. In a 1958 interview, Dr. King said, quote, "I don't think the Republican Party is a party full of the Almighty God, nor is the Democratic Party. They both have weaknesses, and I'm not inextricably bound to either party." Dr. King did, however, weigh in on the Republican Party during his lifetime. In chapter 23 of his autobiography, Dr. King writes this about the 1964 Republican Convention. He said the Republican Party geared its appeal and program to racism, reaction, and extremism. The Republican Party geared its appeal and program to racism, reaction, and extremism. All people of goodwill viewed with alarm and concern the frenzied wedding at the Cow Palace of the KKK with the radical right. The best man at this ceremony was a senator whose voting record, philosophy, and program were anathema to all the hard-won achievements of the past decade. Now, Senator Barry Goldwater had neither the concern nor the comprehension necessary to grapple with this problem of poverty in the fashion that the historical moment dictated. On the urgent issue of civil rights, Senator Barry Goldwater represented a philosophy that was morally indefensible and socially suicidal. While not himself a racist, Mr. Goldwater articulated a philosophy which gave aid and comfort to the racists. His candidacy and philosophy would serve as an umbrella under which extremists of all stripes would stand. In the light of these facts and because of my love for America, this is Dr. King talking in 64, I had no alternative but to urge every Negro and white person of goodwill to vote against Mr. Goldwater and to withdraw support from any Republican candidate that did not publicly disassociate himself from Senator Goldwater and his philosophy. Dr. King barnstormed, so the article goes on to say, Dr. King barnstormed the country on behalf of Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Quote, well, it was President Johnson because he was Kennedy's vice president, and he becomes president when Kennedy's assassinated. Quote, maintaining only a thin veneer of nonpartisanship, end quote, according to biographer Nick Coates, K-O-T-Z. Dr. King called Johnson's win, quote, quote, great victory for the forces of progress and a defeat for the forces of retrogress, end quote. Okay, so we'll continue this on the other side of the break. We'll get into some of these other topics as well, and we'll also talk about what Dr. King had to say about Ronald Reagan. Because remember, Ronald Reagan was the governor of California. This is the African History Network show, 910 AM, the Superstation, the future of radios, 313-778-7600, 313-778-7600. We'll be back in a few minutes. Welcome back to the African History Network show right here on 910 AM, the Superstation, the voice of Detroit. Hey, I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network. 313-778-7600 is the call-in number. If you want me to do a presentation for your group or organization, email me at info, I-N-F-O, at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, info, I-N-F-O, at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. You can also call me, 313-462-0003. 313-462-0003. Call me after the show, okay, or tomorrow. I will be speaking, doing a lecture series at the Nandy's Knowledge Cafe, Saturday, February 3rd, Sunday, February 4th, Saturday 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., Sunday 1 p.m. to 4 p.m., dealing with the history of African American History Month. And we'll also do it. The Light of Ancient Egypt Awakens the African Mind. So we'll have set a flyer up this week at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Okay, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Let's go to the phone lines. Let's go to James. James, thanks for holding. Welcome to the African History Network show. Tell us where you're calling from.
Yeah, hi, Mike. I'm calling from Detroit.
Okay.
West side.
Okay, go ahead.
I got Malcolm basically, most of his activities confined to the north, or he did stuff in the south.
The majority of Malcolm's activities were in the north. When he met with SNCC, he spoke to SNCC. I think that may have been in the south, but the majority of Malcolm's fight was in the north. Even though he was fighting for equal rights and freedom, things like this for African Americans across, in general, but the majority of his fight was in the north.
Right. Okay.
Yep. All right.
Thank you. You got a very good program.
Oh, thanks, man. Thanks. Okay. And then also, I'm not even sure if there was a. I don't know. There may have been one or two or more, but even when you deal with the Nation of Islam temples, right? The Nation of Islam branches or Nation of Islam temples. Well, you have some in the South, but in the deep South, like, I don't know if they had any in Mississippi, Alabama, like during the 50s and 60s. I don't know if they had any then. Okay, I know Los Angeles, but Los Angeles is looked at as the West, right? The West Coast is not looked at as the South. But Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, at that, during the Civil Rights Movement, I don't even know if I don't remember hearing about any Nation of Islam temples. There may have been some, but you hear about them in the north. You hear about Detroit, New York, Harlem, things like that. Okay, so let's get back to this because I get to get some of these other topics. All right. So, ThinkProgress.org. This is the sixth myth about Dr. King. That Dr. King was a Republican. No, he wasn't. ThinkProgress.org has an article, August 28, 2013. No, Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Republican, but here's what he had to say about it. And when you pull up this article, they have this billboard. They have a picture of this billboard that the National Black... call coming in. They have this billboard, picture of this billboard that the National Black Republican Association took out. I'm not sure which state. And it says Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican. And they have their website there. This is just not true. So here's what Dr. King had to say about Ronald Reagan, who is the hero of modern Republicans. Now, when a Hollywood performer lacking distinction, even as an actor, can become a leading war hawk candidate for the presidency, only the irrationalities induced by a war psychosis can explain such a melancholy turn of events. What would Dr. King say about Donald Trump, a reality TV star, right, who's involved in about 3,500 lawsuits, filed bankruptcy 6 times, cheated on all 3 of his wives, has children by different babies' mamas, right? Paid a $130,000 payment to an adult film star to be quiet. What would Dr. King say about Donald Trump? Dr. King, according to the author Garrow, I forgot Garrow's first name, did hold some Republicans, including Richard Nixon and Nelson D. Rockefeller, in high regard. He also was harshly critical of Lyndon Johnson's escalation of the Vietnam War, as we talked about. In 2008, Dr. King's son, Martin Luther King III, said, quote, "It is disingenuous to imply that my father was a Republican. He never endorsed any presidential candidate, and there is certainly no evidence that he ever even voted for a Republican." Okay, and then Garrow claimed there is little doubt Dr. King voted for Kennedy in 1960 and Johnson in 64. And we know it was Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, who was Senator Kennedy, who got Dr. King in 1960 released from jail in Atlanta. And you can read about this, but it's also depicted in the movie King, because during it was in Atlanta, Dr. King was involved in lunch counter sit-ins and things like this, trying to break down the walls of segregation. And he's arrested and he's jailed for a number of days. And Senator Kennedy, this is during the 1960 presidential campaign, he calls Coretta Scott King and he says, you know, "I'm sorry to hear about what happened, Dr. King, and if there's anything I can do, let me know." All right? And he makes a call and he gets Dr. King released from prison. I mean, not prison, jail. He gets Dr. King released from jail. And because of that act, that causes some African Americans who had historically voted Republican, that causes them to vote for Kennedy, and that puts Kennedy over the top, and Kennedy becomes president. Okay? All right. So let's go back to the phone lines. Let's go to line 1. Chuck. Hey, Chuck. Welcome to the African History Network show. Go ahead with your question or comment.
So thank you, Dr. Imhotep, for taking my call. I'd like to know, is there a number that we could call to have you give a presentation during the month of what would be considered African American month?
History Month, yeah.
African American Day.
Yeah. 313 numbers
month of February.
Numbers 313-462 0003. 313.
Okay, can you say that again, please?
313-462 0003.
Okay, and thank you, sir.
Okay, you can also email me at info at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Info at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, because I can respond a lot faster to email than to a voicemail message. But you can call me and I'll respond to you, but I can respond almost immediately to email. Okay? All right.
Okay, I'm on telephone, man. I'm not savvy with
Okay, that's fine. Okay.
I'll give you a call and I'll set something up if it's possible.
Absolutely.
For a presentation.
Okay. All right, Chuck. Appreciate it, man. Thanks for calling. Okay. All right, so that was dealing with 6 minutes about Dr. King. We need to stop spreading and stop believing. Okay. All right. Colin Kaepernick is back in the news. And then also, you can check out this article from thinkprogress.org. We talked about it a little bit last week. Maybe next week we'll talk about it. Republicans praise Dr. King while plotting to dismantle his legacy. Republicans praise Dr. King while plotting to dismantle his legacy. We can look at the S-hole comments from Trump, right? Wanted to bar Haitians and African immigrants and those from El Salvador coming to this country. And we know that African immigrants have the highest educational level, okay, in this country and of all immigrants, especially those from Nigeria. All right? And there's a new study out that talks about this as well. We know that the LA Times had a big article about this also, okay? And I'll get that, let's see. LA Times, TheRoot.com, GoodBlackNews.com had an article about this as well. LA Times article, African immigrants are more educated than most, including people born in the U.S., all right? And we know Nigerians have the highest educational level. Very interesting. You know, what's taking place is that Trump is operating and making policies based upon lies. He's making distorted images. And we talked about 3 weeks ago, the new study from Color Change and the Family Story about how the news media keeps putting out distorted images of African Americans. Blavity.com, Bladity, had this article. New study finds news outlets promote false, negative portrayals of black families that don't match reality. Despite government data disproving them, news outlets perpetuate stereotypes such as welfare queens and absentee fathers, and policies are being made based upon these lies. And what's taking place now, and Trump basically shutting, not taking the deal that Senator Graham talked about that was offered Tuesday before last, not taking that deal and making his S-hole comments on Thursday, January 11th. This is operating based upon stereotypes of African immigrants, Haitian immigrants, African people in general. Then if you look at the white supremacist, bigoted ad that the Donald Trump campaign released, I guess it was released today. TheHill.com has this story, January 20th, 2018. Well, you released yesterday, okay? New Trump ad calls Democrats complicit in all murders by illegal immigrants, okay? The Trump campaign released a new ad spot on Saturday calling Democrats complicit in all murders by immigrants in the country illegally, following the opposition of Democratic senators to a short-term spending bill, which resulted in a federal government shutdown on Friday, okay? And the ad is an ad that talks about stop illegal immigration now, okay? And it really focuses on immigrants from Mexico. It really focuses on Hispanics. It doesn't talk about a whole lot of how about 40% of undocumented immigrants fly over here. It doesn't target undocumented immigrants from Europe or Asia for the most part. Now the campaign forwarded, so this video is from the Donald Trump campaign, the presidential campaign, because he's already started running again, right? I think he's running for Robert Mueller. The campaign forwarded the video ad titled "Complicit" on the first anniversary of Trump's inauguration, after most Senate Democrats voted against the spending patch because Republicans were not offered to include legislation protecting thousands of immigrants brought to the country illegally as children from deportation. That's DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Trump faulted Democrats for the shutdown early on Saturday, saying that the party wants, quote, unchecked illegal immigration, end quote, which is not true. He's a liar. He's a fraud. He's a con man. That's not true. Okay? The Republicans couldn't even get 50 Republicans to vote for their own Republican bill. They only got 45 Republicans to vote for their Republican bill. Now Trump is talking about putting in the nuclear option, so instead of 60 votes, you need 51 votes. Okay? Majority Leader Senator Mitch McConnell said they're not going to do that. So instead of trying to come up with a better deal, they want to lower the standard. This is the same thing they did with Neil Gorsuch. This is how Neil Gorsuch, one of the ways he became Supreme Court Justice. He was such an unqualified white male, they couldn't get 60 votes, okay, for him to be confirmed, so they lowered the standard for this unqualified white male to be Supreme Court Justice, so the U.S. Senate needed 51 votes, and then he got confirmed. This is how he got confirmed, because he was a terrible candidate to be a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. So the president has previously signaled he is open to a fix for DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, after rescinding it last year, but attacked Democrats for refusing to get behind increased border security in exchange for securing votes for the spending bill. Now you had, I think it was 5 Republicans that voted against this Republican bill. Trump doesn't call them out, he calls out the Democrats. Notice this. Now, Democrats have targeted Republicans for using the Children's Health Insurance Program as a bargaining chip, which is called CHIP, and have blamed Trump's chaotic majority party for allowing the shutdown to happen on his watch. Okay? Now, you gotta read the article from the Washington Post from January 15th, written by Josh Dawsey, who was the one who wrote the article on January 11th, exposing the whole S-hole country's comments, right? And it's co-written by Robert Constant and Ashley Parker, January 15, 2018. Inside the tense, profane White House meeting on immigration. Read this article. I don't have time to get to it, because they talked about it a lot on MSNBC. Read this article. Inside the tense, profane White House meeting on immigration, because this led to the breakdown in the deal and the shutdown of the government. Okay? All right, now, Colin Kaepernick is back in the news. And if we look at, this involves Dr. King Day, and YourBlackWorld.net had this article. Colin Kaepernick dismisses those who honored MLK and criticized him for his peaceful protest. So when Colin Kaepernick started his kneeling protest, a good number of so-called black activists and businessmen, as well as media personalities, criticized him. In what is a clear display of hypocrisy, some of those same people came out to honor Dr. King this past week, right? So Monday, January 15th saw Americans and their friends across the globe celebrate Dr. King's birthday, with many paying tribute to the civil rights activist for his role in fighting for peace and human rights. It's good to recognize Dr. King for his selfless work he did for the betterment of our great nation. But Kaepernick was harshly criticized by many people over his peaceful protest aimed at securing racial and social justice, and doing so by kneeling during the national anthem, which is a white supremacist song. That's why I call it the white national anthem, written by a white supremacist named Francis Scott Key, September 13th, 1814, during the War of 1812. So Dr. King was fighting against the oppression of African Americans and people of color because of white supremacy and racism. Colin Kaepernick's doing the same thing. And we'll go to the phone lines in just a minute. Hold the line, Tony. We'll come to you in just a minute. So despite the similarities being so obvious, a good number of people who berated Colin Kaepernick for his protest came out to pay tribute to Dr. King January 15th. See, this is the hypocrisy. Now, it doesn't cost them anything. See, Dr. King is dead. He was assassinated. So it doesn't cost them anything to come out and say, oh, Dr. King was a great man and this and that. But you got Colin Kaepernick, you got a protest right now today calling out white supremacy and racism. So they have to berate Colin Kaepernick while they extol and honor and elevate Dr. King and destroy his legacy. So if you go and look at this article from thinkprogress.org, this is from January of 2017. This is January last year. Republicans praise Dr. King while plotting to dismantle his legacy. They have a social media post from Paul Ryan, the weasel from Wisconsin. Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House of Representatives, and it said, this is from January 18, 2016, 2 years ago. It says, Dr. King spent all his life spreading what he called the gospel of freedom. He called for America to live up to its promise to make all Americans free and equal. His words and his examples inspire us now. But why don't you denounce voter suppression? Why don't you talk about Dr. King calling out white supremacy and racism? See, these people will honor Dr. King and then continue to work to dismantle his legacy. And then they chastise and berate Colin Kaepernick. This is madness. So, despite the similarities being so obvious, a good number of people who berated Colin Kaepernick for his protest come out to praise Dr. King. One of the people who earlier criticized Colin Kaepernick, Tommy Lauren, this little idiot white girl you see, she was on Blaze TV. You see she's a Republican blogger. She's an airhead. She's a total idiot who has no understanding of history. She even referred to Colin Kaepernick, his words as quote, mouth diarrhea, end quote. However, on Monday, January 15th, Tommy Lauren took to social media to praise Dr. King for his fight for equality. She said, quote, today we honor a great man with a great message, hashtag MLK Day. And she also included a quote from Dr. King's highly publicized I Have a Dream speech. And then the article goes on to say, if you remember very well, Donald Trump referred to Kaepernick and all those who don't stand for the national anthem in a protest as sons of B-word, who he said should get off the field. Yet this same president said Dr. King's dream is our dream. This is what this white supremacist wrote. He said Dr. King's dream is our dream. It is the American dream. It is the promise stitched into the fabric of our nation, etched into the hearts of our people, and written into the soul of humankind. This is what Trump said in his weekly address. Now I guarantee you somebody wrote that for him. Because Trump speaks at a 4th grade level. Okay? And studies have shown this. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. Another one of these people on the list who praised Dr. King but attacked Colin Kaepernick was Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones, who threatened to fire his players, NFL players, Dallas Cowboys. He threatened to fire his players who knelt during the national anthem. But he then tweeted in praise of Dr. King, saying, "Today we honor the life and legacy of Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., hashtag MLK Day." Have you studied the life and legacy of Dr. King, Jerry Jones? Have you studied him calling out poverty, racism, militarism? Have you studied him calling out hypocrites like you? So Kaepernick saw some commentators, some commenters, who shared his perspective and decided to retweet a couple of them. So ESPN's Jemele Hill, who Trump has attacked on Twitter because she called him out and told the truth about him, Jemele Hill said, quote, "Me watching people who criticize Colin Kaepernick for his nonviolent protest post MLK quotes today," end quote. NBA veteran and author Ethan Thomas on social media wrote, "Isn't it interesting seeing all the NFL teams who did not hire Kaepernick tweet quotes of Dr. Martin Luther King about nonviolent protests, hashtag MLK Day. But Kaepernick had a nonviolent protest." All these must have been what prompted Kaepernick to share an excerpt from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. He did this on Twitter, on his Twitter page, in which Dr. King writes that he's, quote, "been gravely disappointed with the white moderate and warns that shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will." Let's go to Tony. Hey, Tony, thanks for holding. We got about a minute. Go ahead with your question or comment.
Okay, real quick. Thank you for taking my time, Michael. Hypocrisy, like you said. And those black people who denounced Kaepernick and disparaged him would be the same people if they were 50 years ago would have been protesting and talking about Martin Luther King Jr. then. And now they, let's celebrate him. Because it's substance, it's symbols without substance when you praise somebody and there's no activity to follow up. But what about Reverend King and Malcolm X? Mm-hmm. If they were to come together, oh my God, that display of unity and that the team of the organizational skills that they both possess would have been revolutionary. And we can still do that now if the people who disagree on, this and that, if we can go to the lowest common denominator and know that we all need each other and we need to help each other and unify. I mean, that's the lesson I take from them coming together, and I wish we could do it now. I mean, it couldn't happen back then. They were assassinated. I mean, I don't know. We have to do it now.
So
if not now, then when?
Right. Okay, thanks for calling. Okay, so the followers of Dr. King and Malcolm X need to come together and fulfill their legacy, fulfill the unification, okay? AtlantaBlackStar.com had this story, Huffington Post also, other news outlets, TheHill.com, raw story. White extremists killed more people in 2017 than any other domestic terrorist group. I'm waiting for Trump to tweet about this. White supremacists were behind more than half of the 34 extremist-linked fatalities in 2017, outpacing all domestic terrorist groups, according to recent data from the ADL, Anti-Defamation League. Far-right extremists claimed the lives of 18 people in 2017, data showed, reverting back to a long-term trend where right-wing violence accounted for the largest share of domestic terrorist-related killings from 1995 to 2016. Okay, so check out that article also. Huffington Post had one, murders by U.S. white supremacists more than doubled in 2017. Okay, and this largely due to Donald Trump. Of the 34 people, the atmosphere, Trump has emboldened white supremacists. We saw the August 12th, 2017 rally, Unite the Right, in Charlottesville, Virginia. That's where Heather Heyer was killed, right? Of the 34 people killed in 2017, 18 were murdered by white supremacists, making a 157% increase over the 7 people killed by white supremacists in 2016. I'm still waiting for Trump to tweet this. Maybe one of these black Republicans will get this information to Trump so he can denounce this, okay? All right. So, hey, thanks for tuning in to the African History Network show. Hey, visit our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep. Email me, info@AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, info@AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, INFO, if you want me to do a presentation for your group or organization. Stay tuned for Pastor Mo. We'll talk to you next time. Remember, right now, let's correct wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. You listen to 910 AM, the Superstation, the future of radio. We'll talk to you next week. Peace.